Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Waffle podcast of Evan and Pixie.
Woohoo!
And together we'll try to talk about research about any gobbledygook. Each episode we'll be talking to a researcher who'll discuss the work they're doing, looking at why this research is important, and asking how did they get into this field. We hope that it will be informative and interesting and bring a bit of the academic world into the real world. Today we have Dr. Ruth Brauer, lecturer in Pharmacoepidemiology at UCL. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Ruth.
Hi.
But thank you so much. Thank you for speaking to us today. It's lovely to have you here. Thank you. Do you want to start by telling us a bit about your research?
Yes. So my field of research is pharmacoepidemiology, and it's actually a long word for something that's fairly straightforward. Everybody now knows, because of COVID-19, what epidemiologists do and what these graphs look like. The graphs that you can see in the Guardian newspaper every day, how many people tested positive, how many people were hospitalized, how many people died. Those are the kind of graphs that I make too, but I apply it to the use of medicines. So commonly used medicines. So we can do a descriptive study on pretty much everything. And personally, I like psychotropic medications most of all. So these are the anxiolytics, antipsychotics, and antidepressants. So most of my studies are focused on those drugs. An example is, for instance, we're currently running a study on the use of hormone replacement therapy because there's a lot of interest in that topic once again. And so we respond to that by looking at the medical files of people. We try to find out how many women over the age of 50 are prescribed a hormone replacement therapy over the years, and to see if there are any changes, because these changes are sometimes indicative of policy changes or because somebody found out that the drug isn't safe. And so we have to check the data to see if people stop using these drugs then.
So, yes, I was going to say, so when you said the changes, I wasn't sure if you meant the changes of the individual, so like if the medication is working, or the changes of the prescription of whether, so, but you meant changes in the prescription, whether they are still being prescribed or not.
Yeah, so that depends on the data source that you use. So the most commonly used data source in the UK for us pharmacoepidemiologists are primary care data. And indeed, changes would then be changes in the prescription rates. But in the US, you would use insurance data, so healthcare insurance data, and you can see if any changes are made there. We also have data on a more global level, but that is like the purchase of drugs per country. So it doesn't mean that people actually use these drugs, but we can also monitor what type of drugs governments purchase to be used in their healthcare system. So in the UK, when I say like changes in policies, that's usually reflected in changes in prescription rates. Yes.
And can I ask, how do you gather the data? Do you do it through do the doctors report to you, or do you have focus groups, and patients tell you? How do you gather this data?
So all our data is quantitative. So sadly, I never get the joy of interviewing people or any qualitative studies. They are pre-recorded healthcare data. It's one of those buzzwords that a few years ago we were encouraged to call our group the big data group, or the electronic health records group. That is what we mainly use. So for instance, in the UK, if you visit a general practitioner for anything, there is this opt-out system. If you don't actively opt out, your medical records will be anonymized, and they will then be taken forward for research, meaning that I can't trace any individuals, the names, the where you live, the addresses, but also the date of birth have been completely removed from the records. But these data are uploaded by both the MHRA, so on a national level by the government, and also by commercial data set providers. Primary care data, we get them by going to either the MHRA, they have another subgroup called the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, and they are completely all about the data. So we can apply for the data via them. We would have to get permissions. We have to write a protocol. And it's also tested whether, this study is worthwhile doing. So they have very rigorous standards. Not, you have to have experience in analyzing these data. Otherwise, you don't get the data at all. And the same is true for the commercial data sets as well. For instance, the US data are all commercialized, but it's very hard to access these. You will have to prove that you have experience analyzing these data and that your research idea is a really good one. And
so is it international data, not just from the UK? You mentioned the US. Is it just US and UK or all over the world?
Oh, no, I'm just referring to these because I guess I use these data most often. But the data, you can get them globally. We work mostly with UK data, but last year we published a paper in the Lancet, actually it's Lancet Psychiatry. And that paper was all about psychotropic drug use in 65 countries. So I referred to that earlier. That was when we got the data from governments of 65 countries. And on a global level, we could see what type of drugs, how many of these drugs were purchased. Now, there are huge flaws with running a study like this because we can't really say people are using these drugs. It may well be that the government stocks these drugs and they're not used at all. But it does give you a kind of glimpse in what type of drugs are becoming more popular and which drugs are hardly being used anymore. And then especially if you split global data up by income level of the country, you can see differences emerging, yes.
So you're saying how you get the data, but when you publish your paper, who are you publishing it for? Who is using the information?
I think most of our papers are for clinicians. The bread and butter of pharmacoepidemiology, so to say, is looking at the safety of commonly used drugs. And that message, when you look, for instance, at the safety of a newly released antidepressant, that information is really relevant in clinical practice. We also run the studies focused on the opposite, unexpected positive side effects of drugs. That sounds a bit weird, but often drugs are released into the market for an indication. And what we can see is that a group of people using these drugs is then at a lower risk of outcomes that are not associated with their original indication or underlying illness. An example is, for instance, people who have diabetes seem to have a differential risk of Parkinson's disease. And then when we look at people using metformin versus people using GLP-1 inhibitors or GLP-1 mimetics, this is a fairly new type of anti-diabetic drug. We can see that the people taking these GLP-1 mimetics are actually at a much lower risk of Parkinson's disease. That is relevant information because we publish this so another group that is interested in randomized controlled trials can then set up a study and actually recruit people who may be at risk of neurodegenerative disorders and see whether this drug, exenatide, GLP-1 mimetics, actually helps to prevent Parkinson's disease. So yeah, our research as a standalone, I don't think it brings about clinical change necessarily, but when other people pick it up and then run randomized controlled trials, that's when you see changes happening.
So really what you're doing is bringing all the data together so that, so you're creating a new form of data for others to take and run with?
Well, I think the background of pharmacoepidemiology is actually very much embedded in the way a medication enters the market. So when drugs enter the market, and a really good example is the vaccine against COVID-19, when that was released onto the market, we all understood all of a sudden how few people for a very short period of time had actually used these vaccines. Everyone was like, but it's only been released, just now. And how do we know there are no long-term effects? That goes for all drugs. All drugs enter the market when a few thousand people have tested these drugs. The people testing these drugs in randomized controlled trials are usually healthy. Often a larger proportion is male. They definitely don't have any major underlying illnesses. Drug released onto the market, all of a sudden a real world population is using it. And this is pharmacoepidemiology, really. We have a chance then to collect these routine medical records or electronic healthcare data to see when a real population uses these drugs, and not a few thousand, but maybe a few million, we can actually see if there are side effects, maybe latent side effects or rare side effects that we haven't picked up in RCTs yet.
It sounds like a huge job trying to gather all this data. Are you part of a bigger team that does this sort of work, this project?
Yes, of course. It's that the data we receive are like we do have a lot of data, but computers make the work much easier for us. So we always have people with a background in statistics on board of our team. We run these statistical analyses now with relative ease compared to 20 years ago when you had to go physically to a hospital or to the office of a GP and actually physically go through all these medical records. Some of our, older colleagues have experience with this still, and that was truly a tremendous job. In that sense, I feel like I definitely benefited from medical records, electronic healthcare data becoming, electronical. So our job, whilst big in terms of the quantity of data that we analyze, I do feel it's manageable because we all, we have our different strengths. The statistical analysis by the statisticians, then we as the epidemiologists usually design the protocol, but we have clinicians on board who then interpret the results because that is, they have more of an understanding of what our findings actually mean. So it's definitely teamwork.
I think it's great. I think the work you're doing, the research you're doing, and the findings that you're highlighting, sort of like of cross positive effects, underlying effects. But please tell me this isn't the only way it's highlighted if a drug isn't working or if it's dangerous. That is there another system where, like, if people find out that this actually is quite dangerous and we shouldn't be prescribing it anymore, is there another system where that word is spread?
Yes, of course. So we are the researchers and we do this bit, but the government MHRA proactively sets up studies once a drug is released onto the market, where they, once a drug receives marketing authorization, the pharmaceutical company who produces the drugs, by law now, they are obliged to run these post-marketing studies, so phase 4 or pharmacoepidemiological studies. So the pharmaceutical companies themselves will be on top of it, as well as the governments. And then we too are to some extent involved. Sometimes we get approached by the MHRA to run a study on their behalf, for instance. But as I said, like the positive, unexpected side effects of drugs, that's something that we tend to, that's not something that comes from the government or from the pharmaceutical company. That comes from a clinician who finds something interesting in the lab and then says, listen, I found this in my rat studies or in my cell cultures. It's very promising. Could you run this analysis using your big data to see if we've got something here? So the safety of drugs really does not, or like studies into the safety of drugs once they are released onto the market, does not depend on us. No.
So when you do find a positive outcome, how do you share that information with people who are studying the Parkinson's? Do you go make sure that there is a system for going to those researchers to make sure that it all ties in?
Well, yeah, a lot of our these types of studies receive funding from charities related, for instance, to Parkinson's disease. So automatically we have a way to get the study outcomes out to organizations that then share the word with like patients. But we have to be careful. At the moment, we run a post-marketing study, a pharmacoepidemiological study. You can't do anything with that information. You can't just say like, we found a positive result. We think GLP-1 mimetics lower the risk of Parkinson's disease. At that stage, that has to be rigorously tested in an RCT. So we already make sure that we have the right clinicians on board who can take it to that next step. So in that sense, that's what I miss about pharmacoepidemiology. Like, I'm not in direct contact with, I guess, any of the patients who take the drugs that I investigate. It's always very indirect. And, you know, I do love chatting to people and working with people. In that sense, pharmacoepidemiology is that extra step removed from the people, which, you know, it's fun. But yeah, it is a real computer job, I would say. We spend most of our time sitting behind a desk running these analyses. Yeah.
So wouldn't you find any benefit in adding, so like you've got the data gathering that side of the research, but wouldn't it be useful to have an interview side as well, like just like random interviews with the users to include that with the data to show it that side as well? Would that not be useful?
Yeah, yes, depending on the study, we can add a qualitative study to the study, but it would not be, so that I would go, for instance, to a qualitative researcher, such as my colleague, Sarah Garfield. She would then be fully responsible for that. And we have done that in the past. It's done to some extent, you're able to shed detail on your findings, as you just said. There is a real benefit to adding, for instance, a focus group analysis to a pharmacoepi study, because we can never have the patient perspective or even the healthcare provider perspectives, which are sometimes hugely relevant. An example would be, we're looking at the use of antipsychotic agents now in elderly populations. And in elderly populations, I really mean like when we're approaching 70 to 80 years of age. And these are patient populations that often have several underlying indications, or they use multiple drugs. And then on top of that, they sometimes are prescribed antipsychotic agents. I run the pharmacoepi bit for that study, but for instance, my colleague Sarah, she runs a survey study asking psychiatrists why and how, and getting that level of detail. So yes, what you just said does happen, but it really depends on the type of study that you're running.
That's interesting. I think the whole thing's interesting, especially with the finding. We're very as a being, we're very negative focused. So I think it's good when we've got things that are sort of like finding the good in things as well as the negative sort of thing. No, I like it.
Yes, I like those studies too. Even though, you know, when you then test them in RCTs, it's, you know, the reality is always a bit more muted, shall we say. A nice example, for instance, which I really, really adore, is the fact that people who take Viagra have a much lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. This was a study that was published a few weeks ago, actually, a US study. There were a few minor things wrong with this study, but overall, you know, there might be, you know, a partial truth in this. So we're running this analysis now in the UK. But of course, you get like various factors that contribute to these findings. So the US group found that Viagra takers have a 60% reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. That's huge. That's really huge. But when you look at who takes Viagra, that tends to be the more sociable, physically active population, shall we say. And that's quite proactive to improve their health. And so what you then see, is it the drug, or is it just unmeasured confounding variables that can explain this association. So I love the positive studies, knowing that in reality, probably there are, like, the drug itself might not be a cure or or a treatment, but it's still, I think what we need is starting points. If we find something that might help a little bit, that might lead to the next bit, that might lead to the next bit. So, and in the end, we can find treatments for these currently uncurable neurodegenerative illnesses. I really believe in that.
That's cool. It's funny you should mention Viagra, because I was thinking of that as one of the sort of like positive effects. So because wasn't that set up? They thought they were creating a heart tap against heart disease, weren't they?
Viagra in itself, like, is a story that keeps on giving. I think it really does keep on giving. So yeah, let's see. Maybe in a few years' time we have more information on what Viagra does for your risk of dementia. Would be lovely if it potentially benefits to lower it potentially lowers the risk of dementia. Yeah.
So we talked about your sort of background. So how did you get into this area of research?
Well, I'm originally from the Netherlands, and my real intentions, my true intentions when I started at uni was to become a psychologist, hence my interest in psychotropic medication, probably. But in year 3, we were given access to practice the practical side of psychology. And I realized I find this really quite taxing, and I don't think I'm the right person to do this. So I like contact with people, I guess, but I think I also find the responsibility quite a bit. So then luckily someone at uni said, I think it was a lecturer, like, you might be really interested in research. So in year 4, I then did a master's in clinical epidemiology, and that took me to London. And in London, I started first working for Imperial College, and then I found this PhD advertised at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and that had to do with pharmacoepidemiology. So I thought it was interesting, and luckily I was right. It was very interesting, but to be very honest, like, it is a bit removed from my undergraduate degree, and I think it's, sometimes when you do something, you actually realize, actually, I enjoy this. And so I enjoyed clinical epidemiology. That led me to pharmacoepidemiology. And I actually now can say I enjoy this very, very much. I think that lecturer was right. Research is something that, allows me to use my brain in a really creative way. I don't know, like, it's not arts and humanities. That's, where I feel like the real creative people go, but still, you can think things and then you can test, could it be this, could it be that? And that, like, it's quite satisfying, to be honest.
Yes, it does sound very Sherlock Holmesy. So it's just like aha, and just seeing the patterns and then just picking up the anomalies. I think well, I get it. I'd find that interesting too. I'd really enjoy it, especially if I found something.
Yes, that's right. Let's not talk about the 50% of research where you run these enormous analyses and you're like, oh, nothing. That happens too.
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
To sort of sum up, if you had to, why is your research important to the public?
Okay, so I believe pharmacoepidemiology is important to the public because actually it affects us all. Every one of us who ever takes medications, any type of drugs for any type of indication, even just simple paracetamol, should be interested in it, because medication is never free of side effects. Every drug comes with a potential side effect. And so to understand how we make sure that drugs overall are considered safe, so the risk-benefit balance is considered positive, is actually something that help the public to, for instance, have more trust in new medications. So I'm actually referring to the COVID-19 vaccinations here. I don't want to start a political debate or anything, but I sometimes feel if everyone knew in the UK how drugs are tested and how the MHRA thinks something is considered safe, I think we would have more trust in our medications, because I know what we do to test drugs and I really trust the system. And, you know, that's why I think it's relevant. We all need medications at one or another point in our lives. Knowing why they are considered safe is relevant to all of us.
So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everybody for listening. We'll put up links on our Twitter account, which is at Anti-Waffle Pod. Please do get in touch, as we'd love to hear from you. Bye.
Bye.